Well, today we're going to have a great discussion in store for you. I'm your host, David Gornoski, and we're talking about history. Our guest today is the author of the new book, The Political and Strategic History of the World, Volume 1, From Antiquity to the Caesars, 14 AD. And this gentleman that we have with us is a Canadian born British peer and former publisher of the London Daily Telegraph, The Spectator, the Chicago Sun-Times, the Jerusalem Post, and founder of Canada's National Post. He's a historian, biographer, columnist, and best-selling author. Lord Conrad Black joins us. How you doing, sir?
I'm doing well, David. Thank you for inviting me on.
Thank you. Now, my audience, we talk about a lot of different themes and topics on this program. It's kind of a old school variety show where we just explore different topics that are of interest to our audience. We do some in the world of anthropology, but you are a historian. This is what you do. Why did you put this text together? What is your goal in putting this series
Well,
of
I
volumes?
started as a biographer.
Hmm.
I've written biographies of three of the American presidents: Franklin D. Roosevelt, Richard Nixon, and Donald Trump. The latter two, Mr. Nixon, I knew in his last 5 years, and I've known Donald Trump for many years, to 25 years approximately, and and then I wrote a strategic history of the United States, which obviously the history of the U.S. is a vast literature, and I only write where I can present a viewpoint that hasn't been there before. And this was how the U.S. grew so quickly from 3 million colonists at the end of the Revolutionary War to, after two long lifetimes, to 1945, the the country that had half the economic product of the entire world and a monopoly on atomic energy and was overwhelmingly the most influential country in history, all in two long lifetimes, about 160 years. And and then I wrote a history of Canada because there wasn't really an adequate or up to date one. And then I thought that because of the volume of research I'd done, I wondered if the history of the world, because I'm interested in almost all history, couldn't be made more accessible. And there was the view, and indeed a view that I shared myself, that if you wanted to get any kind of a real grasp of the history of the world, the political history, just how people developed from clans and tribes and bands up to nations and international organizations and the relations between groups, you would have to spend 15 or 20 years doing it and reading 20 or 30 thick volumes like some of the ones behind me here. And you couldn't really do anything else in that time. And I concluded from my own research and writing the history of the US and of Canada that you could actually present the history of the world in 3 or 4 volumes and make it not just a boring chronology that no one could read 3 pages of without falling asleep, but tight enough that you can see a pattern to it. And it's not for me to rate the level to which I've been successful. It's like a person signing his own expense account, but I think it is working. The first volume is out, as you kindly mentioned, and I'm almost finished the second volume, and I believe we can finish in a third volume. My second volume, I'll end just before the American Revolution, so we'll have all of the third volume for the last 250 years.
Yeah, I have we explore a lot of the work of the late René Girard, who was a French American Stanford professor. He has a quote that says, "More than ever, I am convinced that history has meaning and that its meaning is terrifying." Do you believe that history has meaning, and what would that meaning be from your study?
It certainly has meaning because human nature doesn't change much. So you whatever you're reading, it's relevant if comparable situations occur again, and they do. I mean, the comparable situations do recur quite often. I do not agree with Toynbee that as a mechanical and robotic matter, all civilizations start, rise, and fall, and you can predict it, and it's all just like the seasons. You're going from the autumn to the winter and so on. That is not the case. It's in Cardinal Newman's phrase: the more the more it changes, the more it remains the same. I mean, there's a precedent for almost everything, but you have to be fairly knowledgeable to know the precedent in every case. I mean, some are obvious, but many are not. And I don't think the meaning is exclusively terrifying. It certainly can be, but it can also be uplifting. So I admire the work of Girard, but I think I would take that partial difference with him.
Yeah. Do you think history is going somewhere, that it has a direction that you see a current? Because you're studying so many different events at such large swaths of time, and I would imagine you're kind of a big picture pattern seeker. You're looking at patterns, probably.
Yeah, but also I'm accused of being a practitioner of the great man theory of history, which is not true. But on the other hand, people make history. Let us not deceive ourselves. It doesn't just make itself. I mean, people make history, and if there weren't people, there would be no history, and no people to write it, no people to read it. So I present the personalities responsible for the events and developments, and they are by no means all of them great men. Many of them are contemptible and despicable, and many of them are nondescript and very ordinary. But I think you get. If you ask me what the pattern is, and here I suspect disagree with some of the authors you focus on, not necessarily Holland though. In fact, I think not him. I think you can demonstrate that the concept of progress does exist. It doesn't always prevail, and there are horrible aberrations like the culture of Goethe and Beethoven giving us the Nazis and so on. I mean, shocking, mortifying events like that. But if I'll just take the Romans, who Holland is very critical of them, but my book, this first volume, the only one that's out so far, does start as far back as we can get in China, India, and the Middle East, Mesopotamia, and still be dealing with authenticated history and not just folklore. And no one can say that there is not, from then, approximately 3000 BC, up to I end with the death of the first emperor Augustus in 14 AD. There you can't say there wasn't great progress in the abstract. There was. I mean, you had one government that, as Holland says, had its brutal moments, but in general, most people lived peacefully and without being bothered by the government. It reduced taxes from what was there prior to the Roman occupation of the territory. It's one of the reasons it won the fealty of most of the people in the Roman Empire. It was a common market all around the shore of the Mediterranean, all three continents, and as far east as what would today be the border of Iran. And from Scotland to Ethiopia, and from Portugal to Iraq, and a very extensive area. And the case can still be made. I imagine Holland wouldn't dispute it, that the 2nd century AD, the imperial peace, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, was the most peaceful century in history. And you could send a letter from Rome to what is now Istanbul in 8 days, pretty much as you can now. And you could travel on fine Roman roads from what is now Lisbon to what is now Baghdad, with no one robbing you, no inspectors or annoying officials, such as we get now, even going between Canada and the United States. It was progress. It was immense progress from what the world had been 3,000 years before. So there is progress, but there isn't really much progress in human nature, if any. So we keep getting these humiliating, and to use Girard's word, terrifying revenances of ourselves, people, at their most barbarous. I mean, to take this outrage of Hamas against Israel 6 months ago, this was considerably more gratuitously violent and repulsive than any officially sanctioned act by the Roman Empire.
Now, why do you think that we keep having these cataclysmic moments where we look in the mirror and we see such monstrous behavior, and it seems to be a universal issue?
Well, look, I think we have to face up to the gravity of that choice that all people of conscient age have, where it's all very well to blame our creator for the way we were made as a species, but we are, after all, responsible for our acts. We're all sinners, but most of us make a reasonable effort to constrain our sinfulness to levels that are well short of being sociopathic. But
Mhm.
the fact is, it is in the nature of people that transported by certain causes that become perverted in the process of the zeal being translated into action, and outright psychosis, which obviously some people suffer from. We have these terrible lapses, and we try and learn from them. And I dare to hope that we're not going to have anything like the Third Reich in a sophisticated society again. I can't claim that the regime of Pol Pot was any more elevated, but it was, or the attempted genocide in Rwanda, for example. But they were primitive societies. They didn't give us Goethe and Beethoven and other great figures, Thomas Mann and all. The German science and culture is extremely distinguished.
Mhm. You when you I wanted to kind of you talk about the ancient Hebrew history a little bit in this, right? So I wanted one question I wanted to ask you is it's been said and I've thought about it and it seems to be compelling, and as a historian maybe you can correct the record on this, that one of the distinctions that made the Hebrew culture so unique in its time is that it was the only culture that was preserving not only its cultural memory in its victories, but rather also reporting on its failures, on its disobedience, on its waywardness, and also on its defeats and being captured. That they kept keeping a record, not just of their wins, so to speak, but also their blemishes and their hypocrisies. And the prophets, the prophetic texts, keep that kind of exposing some of the underbelly of what was going on in the different periods of their history. And then you have Lamentations and these different things recording their defeats, and that seemed to be kind of a different thing than what most societies don't typically have, a written preservation of their worst moments and their defeats, as well as the ancient Hebrews did. Is that correct, or is that a little bit
I think
simple?
that is correct, and but I think the greatest strength of the Hebrews, the Jews, and it's their greatest bequest to mankind was they were the original champions of monotheism. Now, they were also the champions of a form of revelation where they held that at times the one God actually occupied the mind of a human being. And Yahweh, the Jehovah, was there in human form at times. This was their version of revelation. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the saying, the ancient Old Testament saying was, you go to the kingdom of the Jews, Saul killed his thousands and David his tens of thousands. I must admit, as a Christian, I had not been aware until I got into this quite thoroughly that the Jews have a very mixed view of David and of Solomon. I assumed that they were revered as great leaders, unambiguously so, but that is not the case. I mean, David did some seriously dishonest things. He's particularly taxed for um, sending Uriah the Hittite off to war so he could pleasure himself with Uriah's wife, and Beersheba. But I mean that was a carnal matter. But he's reproached by the Jews for being overly sanguinary in the conduct of war, and Solomon is reproached for having a colossal harem and being grossly extravagant. But the speaking for myself and how you had a kind of conventional Christian but very tolerant education, and we were always taught that Solomon was chiefly a wise man and David was chiefly a brave and a talented man. But the Jews, whose kings they were, have a much more nuanced view of them, and less favorable, and generally prevails in my experience in the Christian world. So, but the fact is, for a long time, for about 200 years, the Romans thought the Christians were a branch of the Jews because they were monotheists, and the decline in the Jewish population, and that this gets muddied in some Jewish history, was not chiefly due to the persecution of the Jews, although there certainly was some of that, but to the fact that 80% of the Jews in the first 3 centuries of the Christian era became Christians, led by Christ himself. And he wasn't a Christian. Who was? But the Jews, it must be said, essentially gave birth to Christianity. And our only real difference with them is that we, being the Christians, is they don't think Christ was the Messiah. They honor him as a prophet and as a great religious leader, but they don't think he was a Messiah. And officially, although I don't think today most Christians think of it this way, but officially the Christian churches think that he was the Messiah, that he was the Son of God.
Yeah. That transition, do you see? I see that when you have the story of the tale of two temples, and that story,
yes,
where you have the temple, a second temple, and then you have Jesus, and he says that God is going to destroy this temple, and he will not resurrect the temple, but he's going to resurrect his body, and so his body is going to become the new temple as an individual. And he talks about this in a lot of different ways.
The mystical body of Christ. Yes.
Yeah. He talks about the Samaritan woman. He talks to the Samaritan woman about how, you worship on this mountain that you guys consider to be the holy place of God. We worship in the temple, but there will come a day when we will all, the world, the cosmos, will worship in spirit and truth. And there's almost a transition going on in this text between the idea of ethnos, of the people, and the idea of the sacred being a collective gathering place built by man as a temple, to now the persona, as this idea of the human person is now going to be elevated to a place in which the Holy Spirit finds a temple within all of him, the possibility of a temple.
And that is the whole concept of the Eucharist, of course. Yeah. You're right.
Yeah. So do you see that as the beginning? I call what Jesus did, and revolution I know is a loaded word, but I often call it the personhood revolution of Jesus, because when that transition happens, the temple ultimately fails and is not raised in vindication, but Christ's body he's killed, and then God raises him in vindication of what he said. There's the birthplace of what we now call personhood, which is the idea that human life is sacred, not because of a member of being a part of an ethnos or a political tribe or identity, but rather because of its own personhood itself.
And it is God's creation. I know. Yeah. I think the greatest influence of the Christians was a humanizing one, even though, of course, all sorts of frightful things were done in the name of the Christian religion on one side and another. But there is no doubt that it had a morally sanitizing effect on the Romans. I mean, gradually these horrible spectacles of throwing people to the lions and other beasts, which incidentally demeaned the lions as well, in my opinion. But that's another matter. That stopped because of the pressures of the Christians, and then the Romans, they didn't do much of it, but they had a little bit at one point of the toleration of human sacrifices, where you not only put convicted criminals into the ring with beasts too physically formidable for a person to deal with, but you just made a kind of ceremonious murder of these people, and not always in the name of even a rather perverted form of justice. And irresistible moral pressures against that degradation of human life did develop, and they're, in my opinion, directly traceable to the Christians. Now, it must be said that notwithstanding what you just said about the replacement of the temple with the mystical body of Christ, that wasn't your expression, but that's another way of putting it, I think. We should remember that much greater temples have been raised up in a way that is not considered sacrilege, certainly not by me anyway, by Christian and other religions. I mean, the Hagia Sophia, which is now a mosque, but the St. Peter's Basilica in Rome must still rank as the most magnificent building in the world and in the history of the world. And there's nothing disrespectful of the word of God in it. It is, after all, a monument to God.
Right. Well, just in the sense of, but the idea of God's spirit being uniquely found in a temple out that somehow is transitioned into God's spirit is now going to be found in human persons.
Yes,
You see what I mean?
potential godliness of people and the accessibility of the deity to people, and the one God for everyone, who respects and requires respect for life.
Yeah.
You're perfectly correct to say this was an immense revolution, and in my judgment, I say this in other ways, the greatest revolution there has been in human history.
Do you see that that same effect of Christianity in the concept of history as a vocation? Because I often think about, you know, how odd it is that we don't think of it because of we're so thoroughly Western and whatever, but we don't think about how odd and how unique this vocation of what we call history is, in the sense that, again, correct me as a historian if you see counter evidence, but it seems that it's a kind of a new idea, the idea of pursuing history in the pursuit of objectivity, in the pursuit of the actual truth of the wins and losses, the atrocities, everything is accounted for. That's really the ultimate, you know, telos of history. But rather, what happens is that, you know, much of what we call history in the ancient world and even after Christ is often being tainted by considerations of politics, considerations of the elite's perspective on things rather than the losers of history, perspectives that favor your ethnos over your competing ethnos in a war or conflict, you know, trying to diminish your casualties of how many you guys inflicted versus how many casualties they inflicted on your vulnerable. All of that seems to be the general standard of history. But there's this other modern term of history where you actually try to tell the truth, no matter what the results are. That's a Christian concept, isn't it? This idea that you don't have an allegiance to your ethnos, you have an allegiance to the truth. Period.
In fairness, I think some others do it, but I do agree with you that the moral factor in telling the story of authentic history, and telling it straight, and without human vanity as much as we can, was largely a Christian effort. Prior to that, history was propaganda,
right?
And it was each people developing its mythos, and it goes on, and you get the two uses of and methods of history confluent. I mean, in the United States, there is an American mythos that, you know, the United States is the beacon of freedom to the world, which can be overstated sometimes. You know, I mean, there are other free countries, and the United States has its shortcomings, but as a place of freedom, but it is substantially true. But on the other side, you have what you just focused on, of the Christian message of the obligation to treat everyone with respect and try and make some material contribution to assisting that everyone is treated with respect. That is also true, and you know, the question that I will put and start to answer in my second volume I'm working on now, just finishing it, is, are we making progress by that measurement? And I say that we are. I mean, yeah. I'm a good deal older than you, but as a young man, I remember there were only about 10 or 15 countries in the world that would qualify as prosperous. When I first went to Brazil in 1968, only half the population was literate. Now it's practically all literate. I mean, the Chinese and the Indians, I mean, they're not how we would wish to be governed, either of them. China's a totalitarian state, and India is largely dysfunctional and quite corrupt. But meanwhile, they are pulling tens of millions of people out of poverty every year.
Yeah.
And this is my view, that progress is real. It just, we shouldn't be smug about it, and we should realize that there's this constant tendency to to relapse into less commendable behavior.
Yeah.
So you have the progressive ideal, and you have the notional commitment of practically all cultures to make things better. But we are sinners, and we do bad things.
Yeah, it's a detente of history that's constantly happening, an arms race between our better nature and our base nature that seems to be kind of escalating throughout history.
And made more dangerous by, in Mr. Churchill's phrase, the lights of perverted science. I mean, we're not dealing with swords and bows and arrows anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, they were deadly, but not like the weapons we have now.
Yeah. There's a kind of, it's, I always say that, when Jesus said, many of the first shall be last and many of the last shall be first, when he would go to his days, his era's entertainment, perhaps a local, like you mentioned, going to see entertainment. If you were a person who was considered the least of these, maybe handicapped, if you wanted to watch the Coliseum games, you might be fed to the lions for that day's entertainment. And today, and the best seat in the house, of course, was given to the aristocrats and the local governor.
Well, the emperor himself.
Yeah, the emperor. But today, if you go into a movie theater, you're going to see not real violence, but simulated violence in your picture. And you're going to see the best seats in the house are reserved for the handicap, and so the best seats in the house used to be given to the governor and the emperor. Now they're given the best eye level view with the screen is going to be for the handicap. And I always say you can see the sacredness of our cultural expectation for how we shall treat the least of these. If you come to a movie a couple minutes late after the movie started, you'll notice the handicap row is completely empty, and you'll see, a couple come in and they're quietly looking for a seat, and they'll go sit far away from one another because it's a packed house, rather than sit together in that handicap row because the improbability that a whole fleet of people in wheelchairs are going to come in 20 minutes after the movie start is so impossible. It's okay. Right. You could sit there. You're not going to take a man's seat that needs it or whatever. But
and you see it in car parking too. You very rarely see people abusing, or in my experience anyway. And I always think of it myself. If you see that, the places closest to the door of wherever you're going, a pharmacy or whatever it is, are reserved to handicapped people. I've never seen that violated.
Yeah. There's so what Jesus, I guess what I'm saying is 2,000 years after Jesus said, many of the first shall be last and many of the least shall be, first. That's kind of happening, in a slow.
Look, I've always thought, always since I got into this kind of thing, that the great evidence of that was that you elected 4 straight times as president a man who was in a wheelchair.
Yeah.
And the American 10-cent piece has Franklin D. Roosevelt's likeness on it because he invented the March of Dimes, and the cure for polio was announced at his foundation at Warm Springs on the 10th anniversary of his death. And incidentally, today is the anniversary of Franklin D. Roosevelt's death, the 79th anniversary. So it was 69 years ago that Dr. Salk announced this at the Warm Springs Foundation and said that this cure of polio and prevention of polio was due to the money raised by President Roosevelt for the charity that he led because of his own condition.
Yeah. Now you're a historian, so I could ask you, there wasn't an equivalent of handicap parking at the Coliseum during the Roman Empire?
I think you made way for the emperor, or you're going to be fed to the lions.
Yeah. So we've made some progress is what I'm getting at. And I also like to point out football, that there's a fixation on how football players sometimes not treating their girlfriends or wives appropriately, being physically violent.
Yes.
They didn't care about gladiators, how they treated their girlfriends back in the Roman Empire. They didn't really care.
No, but remember, there was the Servile War where the gladiators grouped together and staged a revolt. And Spartacus, who Marx claims is the most distinguished person of ancient history. He wasn't. He was really just a brigand, but physically formidable man. He could have made his escape But then, having made his way from just south of Rome all the way to the Alps, he said, I can conquer Rome. And so he went back. And of course, the Crassus, the first triumvirate, Crassus was with Pompey and Caesar, and he was detailed to go and deal with Spartacus, and he did. And the whole road from almost as far as Naples to Rome had these gladiators crucified every 100 yards along the road. Right. So this was the Roman. Finally the Romans replied to this, but the gladiators were they were scoundrels. That's why they were there. They weren't kindly priestly men. They were nasty guys.
Right, right. But they weren't concerned like today. We're very concerned about getting the cushions right in the helmets of football players so they don't have concussions. Yes. They weren't caring about concussions for gladiators.
No, right? No, they didn't. They weren't.
So what I'm trying to show is that even in the ritual, the vestiges of our ritual combat that we still hold, it's Christ haunted, right? We're concerned about the concussions of the vestiges of what we now call gladiatorial, fighters. This time it's simulated violence in the form of football. So we're increasingly concerned with trying to alleviate violence, even though we find more creative ways to let it out. So.
I agree with you on good. This is a kind of a tangent in a way, but not to what we've just been saying.
Yeah.
What concerns me is I think the antidote we're getting to this commendable focusing on helping the handicap,
yeah.
and giving them a full chance as much as we can, is this increasing respect for and even in effect advocacy of suicide. I mean, in this country, I'm speaking from Canada at the moment, there is this program. I won't mire you and your viewers in Canadian affairs, but there is this program called MAID, Medical Assistance in Dying, and our health care plan. It's a universal plan, but it's not been administered properly. It's inefficient, and waiting lines are getting longer. And so now they are out pitching the virtues of suicide if you have practically anything wrong with you, and not even only medical things. I mean, I gather some counselors have been saying to some poor people who've come in and said, we're depressed, we don't have any money, and this is all very difficult. Well, have you contemplated suicide? So, I mean, oddly enough, with this concern for life in our, just to demonstrate the psychiatric Achilles heel of the human race, we're promoting suicide. I mean, a healthcare plan is supposed to promote a longer life expectancy, not a shorter one.
Yeah. I kind of call that concept, this hatred of the body, a kind of pseudo-Gnosticism. And here's what I mean by that. It's obviously that the establishment religious worldview of the West is built on a kind of materialist substrate of assuming that there's a kind of godlessness to the universe, and there's a kind of randomness. But because, we know that the spirit and body in a Christian sense are entwined together in a way that you can't separate, like the Cartesians did, dualism. There's an entwining together in the Hebrew and the Christian tradition of body and soul in a way that's very interesting. And you can't as a society deny the spirit before it will find that the yearning for representing the spirit will come out some way. And the way in which it's come out in our materialist neo-Darwinian world that we're still living in is this virtual reality, right? Where you can transcend your gender. You don't have to worry about, if there's an infectious disease, don't trust your body's natural immunity to fight it off. You must get it from someone who has created, some type of intellectual property of the mind. The high priests of science will give you the greatest drug in the world because, God forbid, your body could not possibly fight off a new infectious disease on its own, as it's made. Yeah. So there's a kind of deficiency to the material, to the body. And that includes things like suicide. Your mind is in a state of despair or what have you. Please leave the body. You're giving birth. You can't trust your body to give birth. It must be now C-section is the dominant way of trying to push people towards birth, because your body is not able to do birth now appropriately. And there's this mindset, of wash your hands, stay sterile, away from other people, hatred of the body, a lot of a kind of pseudo-Gnosticism.
Body and a kind of excessive defensiveness. The French refer to various things as la maladie de propreté, meaning to the sickness of cleanliness. That if you go too far in the focus on hygiene, you reduce your resistance to things that are out there.
Right.
And so I think there's an element of that as well.
Yeah. I want to ask you, as a historian, there's a famous book that a lot of folks are influenced in American academia, Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. When you look at that, when you look at things like the 1619 Project, where you're trying to kind of relitigate history, as you mentioned, America and other nations have a kind of mythos that has some, it rightly needs to confront reality. But the question is, does it confront a kind of alternative mythos in which let's say 1776 as a mythology does need an accounting, it does need a correction for some of the foibles and sins and grievous failures, but then to radicalize that natural desire for the truth into an opposite direction, by which the folks who you used to call folk gods now become folk demons. And there seems to be, that's kind of what's going on here, this dialectical relationship between, we've held these people up in too high regard, we need to balance it down, but we can't find the perfect balance, so we just swing it to the other extreme and start referring to the heroes as monsters and everything is black and white.
I think you have to look into the motives of the people presenting the counter theory. And Zinn, I don't know, but I've read his book, and it's essentially rubbish. It's just a socialist, a biased socialist misrepresentation and a presumptuous imputation of unworthy motives to people who, for the most part, were, I think, well motivated, objectively well motivated. The 1619 Project, I think, just reflects the racist views of the African American extremists who flatter themselves, as you would say, narcissistically, with the view that the entire the settlement of the east coast of North America was in their honor. It was a slave holding and slave developing project. Of course, it was nothing of the kind. That's absolute demonstrable rubbish. The 1619 Project is just as much a fiction as the mythos propagated by Nazi Germany. It's not quite as evil because, as far as I know, they're not actually advocating the systematic liquidation of whole populations, but it's at an equal level of dishonesty and ahistoricity, if you will. I mean, there is no basis to that. Benjamin Franklin was the head of the Abolitionist Society of Pennsylvania. The Adams, John and John Quincy Adams, Henry Adams, Brooke Adams, all of them, they were all abolitionists. John Quincy Adams was, very much involved in famous slave cases where he championed the liberty of slaves, that's just an unbalanced view given for either self-serving reasons on behalf of a particular group or out of an animus towards white American society, which would have a number of different bases depending on who we're speaking of. And my impression of Howard Zinn was he was just an orthodox socialist, kind of a Theodore Dreiser, but not as good a writer. Yeah. But the 1619 people, as far as I've had any exposure to them, are just black extremist myth makers.
Yeah, but I guess what I'm saying is, as a historian, how do you get the right mix, between allowing for a critique of the powerful and those who have been held up as heroes and being able to say, look, well, let's situate this back to look at some of their victims, but at the same time, not going too far and creating kind of cartoonish.
Well, I think first of all, you have to recognize the cultural evolution. Slavery wasn't something that the white European countries, including the settlers in what are now the United States and Canada, really focused on very much, because the real basis of slavery in modern times was the economic use of Africans and Caribbean people as more efficient at bringing in tropical crops because they were accustomed to the equatorial climate. They actually were just better workers at harvesting cotton and tobacco and things like that. And that's why we had virtually no slavery in Canada, other than what the native people, the so-called Indians, did to each other. But when, for example, after the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, the British took over what is now Quebec from the French, in a population of about 90,000, there were only 60 slaves, and the French had a system whereby people could work their way out of slavery within 10 years. And slavery never took hold here because we didn't need people to bring in wheat in the crops of Canada because they're not tropical crops, you see. But the idea has arisen in the minds of some of these black extremists that slavery was the ruling passion of the entire, if you will, establishment of the West. It wasn't. It wasn't. They hardly knew anything about it, and they didn't care about it. And as soon as they focused on it, they realized, in Mr. Lincoln's phrase, in the same measure, I would not be owned by someone else, nor would I own another person. And that prevailed.
Right. It's been popular in recent years, they've been talking about how there's, it's always been a recurring theme, but that, there's so many parallels they're looking in history to see. And oftentimes the Roman Empire gets compared to America. America gets the Roman Republic, all these different, trying to read history to understand where we are in the cycles of history. And do you think, as a historian, there's some lessons that one can glean as to some of these other past empires, like the Roman Empire or the Republic, whichever way you want to situate, the parallel, that could help inform where we're at now and why we're there and how to get into a better place?
I do, and I think the more you examine it, actually, the more reassuring it is that the United States today is nowhere near the state of decadence that the late Western Roman Empire was in. I just want to add one other thing about slavery. We should remember that in the Western world, it was not a it wasn't a reflection of the inferiority of the person for a long time. When countries or peoples were defeated in a war, often the populations were simply sold into slavery. But they were the same pigmentation, they were the same education level, and really their problem was they unless they could get their way out of slavery, they didn't have any civil rights. But it wasn't as if people thought, well, these slaves are an inferior people. That was a function of the economic slavery of America, of importing people from Africa forcefully to what became the United States for reasons of increased agricultural production. But yes, I could go back to what you just said. I do. I definitely do. Yes. I mean, there are lessons to be learned, but with the chief lesson to be learned is right now, today, despite the fact that I think you have a failed administration in Washington right now, and the country is in a somewhat worrisome condition. It is not remotely like the late Western Roman Empire. You have a highly productive and motivated workforce. You have a constitutional system, though it's being strained by the perversion of the justice system to attack the leader of the opposition and others, collaborators of his, and various other things that are real causes for concern. It is a highly motivated and basically patriotic country, still chiefly devoted to admirable causes. And you Americans, for example, those minded to reproach racism in the history of the U.S., should also, to do justice to yourselves, as you would wish to do to everybody, should reflect that no society in the history of the world has gone to the lengths that the United States has to take up a formerly forcibly servile, oppressed minority, a subjugated minority, and raise them up to complete equality, not just emancipate them, but raise them to absolute equality with the majority. It's an ambitious project, and it isn't through yet, but America deserves credit for taking it as far as it has, and it will complete that cycle within the lifetimes of, I would say, maybe I'm too old for it, but a younger person like yourself, I would say.
Yeah, and I think that the danger is just trying to find that balance, because now the leftist narrative is about equity, where it's not just okay that it's equal, but it's that, we have to fire X amount of people of this race and
Yeah.
force,
Well,
these other
I mean
people.
that's injustice of another kind and
Yeah,
can't be tolerated.
yeah,
I mean, it is often attributed to Lincoln, although he didn't in fact say it. It was a newspaper editor in Illinois who wrote it, that you will not help the poor by tearing down the rich. That isn't the way to do it. You
yeah.
help the poor by helping them help themselves
Well,
and
great. Well,
assisting those who can't help themselves. I'd say, please give Rufus my best. I hope he's
yeah,
doing well.
you guys,
No, I'd be delighted to see him. He's a great man. There was a man who was persecuted outrageously, basically because he didn't have the means to defend himself.
yeah. I really appreciate your time, Lord Conrad Black, and I want folks to check out the title of your book. It's available now. It's called The Political and Strategic History of the World, Volume 1, From Antiquity to the Caesars, 14 AD. And I look forward to hearing more about your future volumes as well. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, David. And please give Rufus my compliments.
I will. Take care.
Very nice speaking with you.
Good to
Thanks
see
for
you.
having me.